morning, Rena.
Ah, there she is.
Oh, okay, I'm on the audio now. I want to say that the Saturday service was very nice, Rabbi.
Oh, thanks. I
And
think
that,
Jason does so much. He's the
He
one who
did
does
a
it.
great job, and Jeff and Flossie did a good job reading.
Yes, they did.
I think they should be,
What we went through to
It was a
televise
struggle.
it.
I think they should be permanent.
Yeah, the next time it will be easier. Yeah, permanent readers.
Yeah.
All right, guys, we'll take a vote on that right now. And I know I think most people, if you don't have anybody to share, no worries. You'll be, kicked out of Sun City and you'll be, ostracized for the rest of your life, but no pressure. So what we'll do in a second, when we start, I'll do an introduction, then we'll go around and see what women or girls, and I add girls because somebody may have obviously taken Anne Frank. Yeah, so which women and girls you all decided to choose. But obviously, when you talk about Jewish women, I mean, it runs the gamut of every field, especially in the modern world and even in earlier days. So I looked up several lists. This is one list I liked of top Jewish women. This was from a magazine called the JC, and they have Golda Meir, who we've talked about, Anne Frank, Carole King, Nigella Lawson, who I'd not heard of, Sheryl Sandberg, obviously, CEO of Facebook, Natalie Portman, Joan Rivers, who we have talked about, Judith Kerr, of course, many of you have heard, Hannah Senesh, Evelyn Rose, who I hadn't heard about. It's another a woman who is big in the cooking world. So that was just one list. But if you go online, you see so many different lists. The best list I printed was from the Voice of Cultural Jews, and they have an incredibly long list that I'll send to everybody. And within every category, from contemporary, historical, to judges and rabbis, although interesting for attorney judge, they didn't put any of the Supreme Court justices. So that was interesting. So, and I know everybody else has tons of people from, I know somebody's talking about Henrietta Zold, I'll talk a little bit about Hedy Lamarr, to whoever else people chose. And so it's really interesting that even in times where women were not given the same full rights, there were some women who really proved themselves to go beyond the role given to them. And as we know from the Bible, I'll mention a couple of those who are not as well known. And from the Midrash, there are a lot of women out there who really set the tone. And fortunately, in the last 30 or 40 years, women have really, maybe 50 years, have really proven themselves time and time again as they need more and more rights. So who would like to start with a woman that they have chosen to teach about?
I chose Donna Gracia.
All right, why don't you tell us about Donna Gracia?
Well, I wrote a lot here. So 'cause, I couldn't memorize everything. Well, some years ago, excuse me, I read The Woman Who Defied Kings, and that was happens to be about Donna Gracia Mendes. And it's a long book and written more like a textbook. But I took pieces out of it because there's a plethora of information about her now on the internet and in that book. So because I came from a Sephardic heritage, of course, I was drawn to her and the book. Okay, so I found her life interesting, and I'll read a little bit about her. She was born as Beatrice Hannah in 1510 in Lisbon into a family of conversos. Her family secretly retained their Judaism. She later on, many years later on, changed her name from Beatrice to Hannah, which means grace, therefore Gracia. She lived in Antwerp, Venice, Istanbul, and Ferrara, where she negotiated with royalty for better conditions for the Jewish people. Donna Gracia became a Jewish international banker during the Renaissance after her husband Francisco died, and she became heir to his enormous fortune. So she used her wealth and connections, and she shrewdly operated an underground railroad. I call it an underground railroad. She navigated political waters, and with her courage and bravery, she saved hundreds of Spanish and Portuguese Jews. Conversos, really. They were not Jews at the time. Having her fortune and the ability to lend money and use bribes, including payments to the Pope, she used this opportunity by lending money to royalty, where she gained ties that spearheaded her underground work. She used her husband's commercial empire of trade. His trade was silver, spices, and she traded between Lisbon and Antwerp as an excuse to send emissaries and couriers with goods to safe havens without them having to return. That is how she got the Jews, many Jews, hundreds of Jews, conversos, out of harm's way. She even boycotted the government, had the chutzpah, excuse me, that's not there, to boycott the government many times for executing Jews and then having to flee to different countries to avoid persecution. She finally settled in Constantinople, where she persuaded the Sultan, I couldn't pronounce his last name, so no names, to grant her a long-term lease on the Tiberias region of Palestine. This is where I found it really interesting. Money served her well and the Jewish people well. It happens, I didn't know this, but Istanbul at the time of the Renaissance had many conversos that established a Sephardic community there. That was new to me. So she started one of the earliest attempts for an independent state of Jews in Israel. This is amazing. In 1549 in Ferrara, she was the first person able to openly practice Judaism in a Sephardic community. She built synagogues. She supported literacy and printing. Stop phone. And where am I?
What is literacy?
Phone, yeah.
And printing.
It's Joan Schwartz, Judy, our president of Hadassah. Okay, she was the first person to attempt a modern Zionist movement, and some have called her the most important Jewish woman, some scholars, since biblical times, which is really, she was. I don't know why we didn't hear about her. All my life, I've heard about all these people, but never about her. So she died in Istanbul in 1569. And for 500 years, as I said, we have not known about her. She's sometimes referred to by historians, I can't talk anymore, is the first person, well, I said that, to try a modern Zionist movement. I just have something to recommend. If you find her life interesting, as I do, there are pages of information on the internet as well. And if interested, I would recommend the book. I'm reading it now. Gracias Mendez, Power, Influence, and Intrigue. There is so much more about her that I could go on for an hour or more, but it's amazing. Has anyone ever heard about her?
No.
I'm not over either.
Could
Well, I've learned
you,
about her for about 15 years since I read the book,
That seems
written by
perfect,
Brooks.
perfect way to start. Jeff, did you have a question?
yes, could you please give me the name of the book again?
The book, the first book I read, The
Mhm.
Woman Who Defied Kings.
No, but the other one.
What was the one you liked?
Oh, that was my first book. The other one
Okay.
is Gracia Mendez. I'm reading that now. Power, Influence, and Intrigue.
Of course, Mendez will be a very famous name in the American Sephardic Jewry, including some in our synagogue here. So, I
Well, that
wonder-
was her husband's name. Mendez
Yeah.
was the husband's name. She
I
was
wanna-
born Nasi, and De Luna was her father's name. Nasi was her mother's name. So that's where you get all these names. Donna Gracias Mendez, well, she gave herself Gracias. Mendez Nasi.
Carol, I have a question. Is Donna her name, do you think? I thought maybe it
No,
was
she was
it's
born
like
Beatrice.
Donya.
She was
Donna.
born, sorry, I'm
No,
sorry.
but I meant, isn't it like Mrs. or in
Well, she was
Spanish?
called Donna. I think it's a name of respect. That's what I got out of it.
Yeah,
It's
like
the
Doña.
Don in Italy, the Don.
Well, I'm
yeah.
saying in Spanish, Doña would be the way they refer to a woman as a title, not her name.
Well,
Doña.
she was well
Yeah,
respected.
that's why I
Yeah.
thought it was. So Donna in Portuguese, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay,
All right, thank you. Great way to start.
good. Yeah.
That was awesome. Anybody want to go next? Stewart's.
Yeah, I chose a character from either, a woman from either, even further back, for Berea.
Hmm.
And the reason I
Can't
chose
hear
her,
him. I
Is
lost
it
sound.
a Berea or Berea? Berea, right?
Berea. And the reason I chose her is because I was very friendly with a rabbi when I was in Atlanta, rabbi who's now in Cleveland, I think, Rabbi Stephen Weiss. And he named his daughter Berea. So it sort of interested me in who she was. She lived in the 2nd century, about 100 years after the destruction of the temple, and was really known very much as a scholar. She's one of the very few women who's mentioned in the Talmud, as a matter of fact. Daughter of one of, I don't know if you've heard of the 10 martyrs of Judaism. She was the daughter of one of those and the wife of a very famous and important rabbi. In a sense, I guess, she becomes a model of Rashi's daughters in that sort of sense. So I'm going to use 4 very short incidents to give an idea of who she was. All right. The first of these stories about her is that she is reputed to have studied 300 matters or 300 items of a halacha, Jewish law, every day. And that would have made her an amazing scholar. Would be an amazing scholar to study 300 a week or a month, for that matter. So she really spent a very large portion of her life as a scholar. So much so that even though she lived in these days when women were not very much accepted or expected in the scholarly endeavors, she was a frequent consultant to the sages in matters of law, and especially in matters of Jewish law as going toward women. She was an expert, particularly in the laws of purity, for example. And she was a recognized authority. In one case, as a matter of fact, she had a dispute with her brother, and it was ruled, or not ruled, but it was said that she was a much greater authority than her brother. And that would be great praise today. In those days, it's absolutely remarkable. The second one is that she had a sister, and the sister was carried off, was kidnapped by the Romans with the intent of sending her to Antioch to become a prostitute. Berea urged her father to go to Antioch, which would have been a great risk to a Jewish scholar, to save her sister, something that would not ordinarily have been done. Not only did he go there and succeed in doing that, but at her urging, he managed to obtain proof that the sister had maintained her purity at the time, which would have been very, very important. Because of this, she ended up going to Babylonia, and that's, of course, the place where Talmud Bavli has come from, which explains perhaps her notice in the Talmud. Third is a matter of something that she preached or taught. Her father, Rabbi Meyer, was really getting bothered by noisy neighbors. I guess there are some of us who know about that, and who decided that to take an inappropriate action. He actually prayed to God that God get rid of these pests, that God kill the neighbors. Berea heard him say that, and she went and argued with him about the text that he was using to justify this, talking about a thing from Psalms, where her father was interpreting it as, may the sinners disappear from the earth, And she pointed out that he was wrong and it should have been made the sins appear from the earth, so that if the sins disappear, don't kill the evildoers, help them get rid of the sin. And in doing so, then get rid of the evil and you don't have to worry about it. That's a very, very important Talmudic concept. The last one, it's an amazing story to me. On a Sabbath, Rabbi Meyer, her husband, and she lost two sons suddenly. Two sons had died. And of course, the inclination would be on the Sabbath to go to those two sons, to go to the husband, whatever he was doing, in this case, studying in the Beit HaMikdash, and inform him. And she decided that she didn't want to inform him in that way, that it would be too painful to him. Reminds me, as a quick aside, of the joke about, the cat fell off the roof and died, and then informed your mother climbed up onto the roof. It's a silly joke about that. But anyway, what she did was she delayed until after Havdalah and after the evening prayer. And at that time, she went to her, the evening meal rather, she went to her husband at that time and asked him to answer. She said, Meyer, I have a question for you. What shall I do? Some time ago, I was left with something, a piece of information was left with me for safekeeping. Now the owner has returned to claim this thing that was left to me for safekeeping. May I give it away? And Meyer, of course, was sort of stunned by this kind of a question, the answer being so obvious. It's a very strange question indeed, he said. How can you doubt the right owner, the claim to what belongs to him? And she said, well, then I want to return it without letting you, didn't want to return it without letting you know about it. She told him. She then took him into the bedroom where the two dead sons were lying and uncovered them. She had them covered up. Meyer, seeing the sons, realizing they had passed away, burst into weeping. My dear husband, she reminded him, didn't you say a moment ago that the owner has the right to claim his property? God gave and God has taken away. Blessed be the name of God. And it was at that time that Meyer recited the important proverb, Eshes Chayil, a woman of valor. A woman of valor who can find, for her price is above rubies. The heart of her husband does safely trust in her, and he hath no lack of gain. She doeth him good, and no evil, and she doth him good and not evil all the days of her life.
Thank you, Stuart. That was a really terrific
Maria
one,
was.
too. Really terrific, of course. Anybody have any questions about Bruria?
I was just going to mention that we had in New Jersey, in Elizabeth, an Orthodox girls' yeshiva high school named Bruria.
It's named after her.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. That's right. It's interesting that when you do any research on her, that school's name comes up first and most frequently of all the references to her.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Stuart. All right, that was really terrific. We had two terrific ones already. Anybody else have one they'd like to share? Okay, Judy.
Yeah, well, I'm going to talk about Henrietta Zold, a name very dear to me, and we know her as the founder of Hadassah. However, she was born in 1860 in Baltimore, and she was an educator, social activist, humanitarian, and most of all, a Zionist. She was the eldest of 5 daughters of Rabbi Benjamin and Sophie Zold. And she herself became an educator in Baltimore, although she never had the opportunity to go to college. In 1889, she organized a night school for Russian immigrants. So her most important thing for them was that they learn English so they could succeed in the United States. And in 1893, while she was working for the Jewish Publication Society, she became their secretary. She also did a lot of editing and other work. She was the only woman on that staff in that organization. In 1903, after her father died, she and her mother moved to New York, and there she wanted to study Hebrew and Talmud. So she approached Rabbi Schechter at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and he allowed her to be the only woman to study there, but she had to promise that she would not seek ordination. Of course, she might have been our first conservative woman rabbi, who knows, but she had to make that promise. In 1909, when she was 49, her mother, who was now 77, and another woman traveled extensively through Europe and ended in Palestine. And they saw there the horrible health conditions. They said at the time, I think there were less than 100,000 people living there. There were just, everyone lived within what we call today the old city, because outside was full of beasts and heathens. And they had garbage piled up 30 to 50 feet of garbage, open sewers, and there were terrible, terrible health conditions. The most serious were eye conditions called glaucoma, which were caused by flies, and also very, very poor maternity care, very high death rate. So when she came home, she had started a study group, and her mother said, "This is a project for your study group. Fix these health conditions." So in February of 1912, her study group became Hadassah, Daughters of Zion. And of course, Henrietta, being quite the leader, was the first president. In 1913, they collected enough money to send 2 nurses to Palestine. Now, they didn't collect all the money because they knew how to ask people who had money. And of course, they got Nathan and Lena Strauss, who were the department store magnates. And Nathan Strauss said, "I will take the nurses to Palestine and I will pay for 4 months. And after that, your group has to foot the bill," which they did. And the nurses stayed, well, one stayed for several years, one stayed for 1.5 years. During that time, Henrietta traveled all around the country to start new chapters of Hadassah. And by 1917, they had 4,000 members and 47 chapters. And I will tell you that today we're just under 300,000 members, and we are the largest Zionist organization in the world, and of course, one of the largest women's organizations as well. In 1918, Hadassah was part of a very large mission that was funded in a great deal by the Rothschilds. And they sent 45 doctors and nurses to set up a medical unit. And this group went over on a troop ship. And they had with them 2 ambulances, 8 vehicles, and the Rothschild gave them, or let them have their hospital that they had built in Palestine to use as their base. So in 1920, when Henrietta was 60 years old, she moved to Palestine so she could direct this medical unit and the hospital. And she ended up settling there, but she did go back and forth to New York. And she became the Hadassah, well, actually this hospital was called the Hadassah Zionist Executive. So in her spare time, in 1930, she became a member of the Vaad Leumi, which was the National Council of Palestine, which basically dealt with the social services for the country. And also she was conferred a Doctors of Law degree by the Jewish Institute of Religion. And that's one of many, many honorary degrees she's been given. In 1933, when she saw what was happening with the rise of Nazism in Europe, she founded Youth Aliyah. And over the years, they brought 11,000 children from Europe to Palestine, and then 2,000 more from Arab countries. In 1942, and this is one of her really major accomplishments, she co-founded a political party in Palestine. It was called Ihud, I-H-U-D. I had never heard of it. And they wanted a binational solution. So she was really way, way ahead of her time with that. She has so many things, wonderful things she's done over the years. Israel has a commemorative stamp for her. She was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. She's buried on the Mount of Olives. In her legacy, she has, these things have been named for her. There's Kibbutz Kfar Zold in the Upper Galilee. The Palmach named one of their illegal ships for her. In 1949, Hadassah established the Henrietta Zold Prize, and the first recipient was Eleanor Roosevelt. There's a Henrietta Zold Institute for Behavioral Sciences in Jerusalem. Public School 134 in Manhattan is named for her. There's in Baltimore and in the East Village of New York, there are streets named for her. And in 2007, in Seneca Falls, New York, she was honored to be part of the National Women's Hall of Fame. Of course, in 1934, the Hadassah built their first hospital on Mount Scopus. And then after the 48 war, when that was occupied by Jordan, and years later, they broke ground at Ein Kerem, where today they have 2 hospitals now. We have our newest tower. In Israel, even though Henrietta never was a mother herself, she never married, Mother's Day in Israel is the 30th of Shavat, which is the day that she died. So she proved the power of women's activism. She emerged from a male-led Jewish organization to found one of her own, showing that women could indeed change the world.
Thank you. That was beautiful. And of course, she is, I'm sure all of us have heard of her, and we know the effect she's had on this world. And even today, Hadassah is a very strong organization, not just for Aliyat Israel, but for health concerns around the world. So, any questions before we go on?
A comment and a question.
Larry.
On Seneca Falls, so we were there a couple of years ago, and it is a marvelous museum in which you can, there is a large number of women's statues there. I don't recall hers at the time, but wasn't paying that much attention to each individual. And you walk among all of these women as though they're part of your history, and you can almost, that's the nice thing about the statues. But the thing I wanted to ask Judy is, what is Hadassah today? Is it, I kind of thought, is it largely a US organization or?
No, it's international. It's international. Hadassah is the Women's Zionist Organization of America. And aside from, in addition to the hospitals, we have in Israel clinics all over the country with community colleges, youth aliyah villages where troubled children are brought. In fact, lots of children from Russia are still brought there and live there, to integrate them into Israeli society. There's health clinics, community colleges, nursing school, medical schools. I mean, it's vast. And I'm looking at everybody here. I don't know, Arlene's a longtime member, Jane, Karen, Carol's on our board. Rena, I think you're a member, Flossie's a member. I don't know about you, Harry. I have to get you to join. So, and for the men, Jeff's an associate member, as is my son. So men can join too.
But is the largest organization a US based, I guess, was my.
We are the world's largest Zionist organization.
But the US participant part of it is what I was trying to get at.
What?
Yeah.
If you distribute it geographically, is the US the largest
Oh, yeah.
Hadassah?
Yeah, by far. Harriet, you're Arlene. Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to mention, my grandmother in the 1930s was a Zionist, and she belonged to Hadassah in Paterson, New Jersey. So my grandmother, my mother, myself, my daughter, my 3 granddaughters, and I'm making my great-granddaughter a member. So we're going to be a 6th generation Hadassah members. And Hadassah has been going back all the years. And as I said, my grandmother in the 1930s, Paterson, New Jersey had a Hadassah chapter.
I still think you need to write an article about that for our contact,
Okay.
my wife. Because you told me that before, and that's as soon, I think when you actually do it, and then you can write an article, it can be a short one, we'll put in a contact. I'm sure Hadassah Magazine would love that. So I think should be a definitive
Yeah.
coup if you could write something like that. I don't
All right,
think
thank you.
that's very
Yes.
often.
And also, if you go to Israel, in the original building at Ein Kerem, in the synagogue, of course, are the beautiful windows that Marc Chagall created for them, which most tourists go to see. But if you do get to go now, you can go visit our magnificent new tower, the Sarah Wetzman Davidson Tower, which has 6 floors of operating rooms below ground. It's to be in there is just amazing, and just what women can do. right?
Yeah, thank you. And of course, the other two were just as important, but of course, Henrietta Zold is much more well known, certainly in the modern world, especially for her contributions in the 20th century. When did she die again? Remember?
She died, yeah, I do. Wait, did I put it here? She
I
died
remember if she lived to see.
She died right before the end of the war. She died in February of 1945,
Yeah.
which is a shame. So she
Yeah.
never got to see the war.
Never
field.
got to see it, just kind of like some of the other greats like Theodore Herzl. But so that was really fabulous. Thank you, Judy.
Oh, you're welcome.
All right, anybody else want to share? All right, Jane, I think, and Jane and then Michael.
Okay, it's interesting to see that we picked people who are so unknown, except for, of course, Harriet Paul, except for the Hadassah person. I chose Regina Jonas. She is an unknown rabbi and the first rabbi to ever be in recorded history to be ordained. And she was ordained by the Orthodox, surprisingly, although that says progressive, the Orthodox did accept it. She was born in Germany in 1902 and died in 1944. It was largely a poor family, but she did go to school and she studied and she went, her desire to be a rabbi was not really accepted, even though she was in high school learning what the men were learning.
Jane, I think we lost you. Did we lose anybody else?
Excuse me?
Is everybody else frozen or is it just me?
Yeah, you're frozen, Rabbi. I think I see other people moving.
I
You're
can hear
frozen.
Jane.
Yeah, we're good.
You're still frozen, Rabbi.
Is anyone else having trouble with sound? I keep on losing my sound.
No, I'm not.
And I'm coming back in, I'm leaving, coming back in, so I don't miss anything, but
I'm fine.
it's really annoying. I don't know what's causing that.
No, it's-
Anybody very good
No,
with the
I'm fine. I
computer?
heard perfectly.
Judy Glazer, you know anybody that's good with computer?
Sometimes you have a weak signal that goes on and off.
Jane, why don't you just continue, Jane? Because looks like everyone else is on.
Yeah, the rabbi is still frozen.
The rabbi's having a problem.
Just wait for,
Everyone else is on. Why
Probably
don't you
again.
just continue, Jane?
Probably sign in again.
yeah, let the rabbi just sign in again.
But he started the meeting.
I
He's
know,
our
he's gonna
host.
have to sign in again. He probably
Jane,
went.
go ahead. What's silly? Just
Go ahead, Jane, please, because it may
Okay.
take him a long time. Jane,
I'm here.
Okay.
Please
all
go.
right. All right, Stuart, we got it.
We got it. Okay. In high school, she expressed the desire to be a rabbi and did attend the religious school that did offer men the chance to become rabbis, but women were considered teachers. So she only graduated with a teacher's degree. And although the Orthodox establishment had spurned Regina Jonas's desire to be a rabbi, the rise in the Nazi regime changed everything. As persecution of Jews increased, the number of rabbis, unfortunately, in the community decreased. Many left Germany, and many were just persecuted, not just, but persecuted. She was ordained in 1935, after Rabbi Max Steinman, executive director of the Germany's Conference of Liberal Rabbis, approved of her ordination. And she got her smichas, her ability to be known as a rabbi. She preached in synagogues, and because the rabbis had emigrated, and cared for the elderly relatives of people who had fled. As war broke out, the situation for German Jews worsened, and she was put into factory labor, eventually deported to Theresienstadt. Despite the setback in Theresienstadt, she did preach and she did hold services within it. Jonas died in Auschwitz in 1944. She did leave written documents and written sermons that have been found. And it wasn't until recently, I guess, that these were found. The rabbi Leo Beck and the psychologist Viktor Frankl were friends of hers, and did survive the war. When Sally, none of her male colleagues brought her work to light in the decades after the war. When Sally Priesent became America's first female rabbi, and it was interesting because we have cousins who were married by her. No one knew about the venerable predecessor. Nobody knew that somebody else had become a rabbi. It was only after the Berlin Wall fell and the East German archives, including those in Theresienstadt, became available that researchers eliminated her work. I'd like to read, illuminated, I'm sorry. I'd like to read something that she had written. I'm okay. Her work is notable for arguing the female leadership. And she wrote, and I quote, "Aside from prejudice and unfamiliarity, there is almost nothing halachically opposed to the woman taking on the rabbinical role." And that's it. Anybody else?
I have a
I
question for
just
you.
find it fascinating that all of these fabulous women did not come to the fore. I mean, it just started in the last 10, 15 years that I started hearing about these fabulous Jewish women that we had never heard about. And I wonder if it's because we're starting to make a fuss, you know? I just don't understand why before the historians never brought it to the fore for the public. Does anyone have a comment about that? Because it's,
Well, I think there's been this movement, even like in Passover, the Haggadahs now, the women's Haggadah. which
yes, with
you
the
know, that
orange.
goes back several years, you had the oranges. And
Right.
I think there has been, sort of more of inclusive of, the women in the, even in some of the prayers, where you, not only Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you add the women's names as well. So I think there's sort of that recognition even in the service. So, but you're right. I think the women's movement obviously is, and this has been a spur for that, for women getting to the forefront. Yeah.
Look at Flossie's holding up. Flossie's holding up.
I just wanted to tell you, your woman, we'll call her Donna, since she's your good friend here.
Thank you.
All right. How it
My
started,
relative.
I have the book, Great Jewish Women.
I
She
see.
is mentioned in it. So I'll have a copy to show you. She is.
I'd like to.
mentioned
Thank
in
you.
this book. All right. And actually Henrietta Zoll is too. Janie, your rabbi isn't, but this is just the first edition of this, but Donna is mentioned. So thank you for bringing her to life.
Jane, I have a
Yes.
question, Jane.
Yes.
Did you say, or do you know where she went to school?
Yes. Let me look it up.
It was in Germany, but
It was in Germany.
Germany.
Yeah, no, I meant the name of the school or who ran the school.
Okay, yes. 1 second, please.
it seemed to be some sort of a seminary from what you said.
Yes, it was, but they graduated both women and men, and the women were graduated as teachers.
Right.
It
Well,
wasn't.
that's what
like-
HEC did for many, many years. And Jewish Theological Seminary.
We'll find it and get back to
You
you.
let me know, yeah,
Yeah, we'll get back to you.
Blas,
thank you.
Yes,
I have a question about that book. When was that first published, the one you're holding up?
let me look, hon.
I'm curious as to how long it's been out
Uh,
for our
It
consumption.
was first published in 94.
Oh.
Second printing was in 98, and the last one was 03. So you could see there are many other women that present day could be
Right.
added. And I got it from the library in Bluffton. And with the pandemic, I've had it out a while. I keep reading it every day, a few. But when you gave your name, I looked it up, and Jeff and I were, whoa, she's here. So thank you.
How about if we continue with Michael?
Yeah,
What's
Michael, yeah.
Michael, then
Yeah, okay.
and I have one as well, but
Okay, and I have, the woman I'm going to talk about certainly isn't in the book, and it's going to be a little different from these very, very good presentations. I want to talk about Felice Schragenheim. And what intrigued me, I went to a list to, Jewish women, and she was on the list, and it listed her as a lesbian and partisan. This is during World War II, and it kind of piqued my curiosity. And she was born in Berlin in the 20s. Has anybody seen the movie Amy and Jaguar? I hadn't heard of it, and apparently this is a movie about her and her lover, whose name is Lily Wust. And Lily's, I'm talking about Lily now, was a German military officer. And what's intriguing or interesting is that they did not hide their affair. And of course, in Germany, during that time, I mean, homosexuals were persecuted as much as Jews. And I guess if you're a Jewish homosexual, I mean, my God, it's like a double header. And they were pretty open about it. I mean, about their relationship. I don't know if, people could have thought of them as friends, possibly, as opposed to lovers. And in fact, her lover had no idea for a long time that she was a partisan. I could not find anything about her activities until maybe about a half hour before we started the class. And it turns out that what she would do is she would disappear for days at a time, and she would, go underground and help women escape from Germany. And apparently she helped quite a few. But there really wasn't anything about her other than, this relationship. So that's my report. But I think, you have to ask questions, what makes her remarkable? Why was she included in the list? And I have no idea. And then, you can expand that question to, what makes people remarkable, to be on a list of great Jewish women, great, whatever. And I think it's an interesting question because, our tradition is, you save one life, you've saved the world. And, and that's, maybe that's why, because she saved lives during the war. From a Jewish perspective, since she was, a lesbian, you might ask, what does that say about Jewish tolerance for different, different people? And I think that's important. A non-Jewish question I have is her lover didn't die until the start of the 21st century.
Wow.
who's the
So
author?
how did she survive the Nazis?
Sorry,
being,
my internet went down, so I'm glad the meeting kept going.
welcome back.
Thanks.
So how did she survive as a homosexual in Nazi Germany? She didn't go into hiding, as far as I could tell.
Michael, was she Jewish?
No, she was German.
She was German. And
Yes,
so maybe they just said, oh, they're friends.
that's possible. What I suggested earlier, but it's very unclear. So anyway, I chose somebody about whom I was able to find little information, but nonetheless, it was interesting to read whatever I could find and to ask questions about, why are people significant, and, how society changed, and things like that. So anyway, that's it.
What was the name again? I missed it.
Yeah, the name was Felice Schragenheim. And she was listed as and what piqued my interest, she was listed as a lesbian and partisan. Was somebody born in Germany in the 1920s. She died, when she was rounded up. They finally found out that she was Jewish, and they rounded her up, and she was in Auschwitz. And she died on one of the death marches after the crematoria were destroyed. And it was the same time frame. I mean, my mother-in-law could have been on the same march, and so maybe that was another reason it kind of piqued my interest. But they really don't even know when she died. Her family thinks she died in 1945. The records at Yad Vashem say 1944. December 44. So there's very little that we really know about her, other than that she had this affair with the wife of a German soldier.
And she was an underground partisan.
Yeah, but we don't know anything about her, or at least I don't know anything about her activities.
Right.
Because there were so many partisans. Why was she significant and not others? I don't know.
You'd have to ask the forward that question, and I think part of it came from this exhibit they did of artists that they had found in the forward there, and that was part of the thing. So I don't necessarily know whether or not, and I had the same trouble with the one that I'm going to talk about, the Luca Russia, as far as her significance, but the backstory became so interesting that I got so involved in it. But I think a lot of what you say is they're not of the same mold as Henrietta Zold or some of the more prominent, the Golden Maiers, but they have a story to tell.
Larry, that's absolutely right. When I was putting together some words, if you can bear with me for another 2 minutes, I was thinking about a woman that I worked with. She grew up on the Lower East Side. Her father was a Chazan, and she went to work for the same organization that I did, but probably 20 years earlier, maybe more. She graduated from law school in 1945. She was the only woman in her class, and she winds up working for this organization, which was really male-driven. Probably at that time, probably 30% of the employees were Latter-day Saints. She wouldn't work on the Yom Tovim. And she rose, she had a significant position. But, she was never part of the management team. Somebody in her position should have been given a little more access, I would say. That's the right word. And but she was really significant. She was the first woman to have that level of position in this organization, Jewish, and she practiced Judaism. Didn't hide it. I mean, to me, that's a very significant thing also. Because when I worked there was still an undercurrent at times. I mean, when I wouldn't show up to work because of the holidays, people kind of looked at me like, huh? So, anyway,
And there's probably so many people like that, of course, who don't become famous for one thing or another, but so it's hard to, you know, so many courageous people that only a few of them make the news. Larry, you want to finish us off?
I just want to.
Oh, please, Jane.
Stu had asked me a question and I wasn't
Sure.
sure of the answer. And I looked it up and now I can't find it again. Okay, here we go.
Oh, computers.
It was the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft der Juden. It was something, Higher Institute for Jewish Studies. It was a rabbinical seminary established in Berlin in 1872 and closed down by the Nazis in 1942. And the name was officially changed to Lehranstalt für die Wissenschaft der Juden. I guess it's the learning center for the Jewish people.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Larry, you want to continue?
Yeah, I chose the first one on the list because I was, and I didn't even look at the whole list, but I was fascinated by the caption underneath it, which said that this was a woman that financed the Westminster Abbey. And she was in London. So I said, well, that's kind of an interesting story. So, and I know the rabbi has spoken about Jews in London before. And by the way, I had just sent out an email to everybody with an enclosure from Ralph Goldberg in which there's a rabbi speaking before the House of Lords. This is a very current thing. I don't know the date on it, but I'd like you to look at that thing there, in which he's basically talking about anti-Semitism that is virulent now in England at this time. And he's making a plea to the House of Lords for a debate on this. And he's saying there are 3 conditions. Well, I'll let you look at it, but it's only a 2 or 2.5 minute video. So please look at that as well, just concurrently. But
Larry, that is Rabbi Sachs. He's the chief rabbi of Great Britain. And
I didn't know that.
He's also a member of parliament, at least for the last maybe 5, 6, 7 years at least. He's an elected member of parliament as well.
Yeah, if you get it.
That's been going around a while. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Do you know when the video was?
I don't know. I saw it a while ago.
Yeah, what I was going to suggest to Rabbi Huss, I know he does this interview group, which I really have to plug because that interview yesterday was superb with this girl who made Aliyah to Israel. And it was just so, I guess, so real, to see somebody, who's an American, who's living there now under the conditions that are so harsh. And but it was just a terrific interview. And if you get a chance, watch it on YouTube. But Carol Rosenberg's, Carol and Ken Rosenberg's family obviously live in England. And maybe we can get them to her kids, to someone you could interview, and as far as what's going on.
Larry, they live in Manchester. They're black hats. They don't approve of or even see us as Jews.
I don't think they'd be willing to be interviewed.
I can tell you, I've met the son.
Okay, bad idea. Sorry. Bad idea.
You can ask them, but I mean.
Okay, all right.
They're not what we call mainstream. They're.
Okay, I thought they might be modern Orthodox.
No, absolutely not. Not at all. Nope.
Okay, let's get back to someone with a really, really interesting name, and the name is Licoricia. Now, as Carol mentioned in hers, that they adopted the name Gracia, and it was apparently interesting at that time that people could pick out names, and some of the names that were picked out were to kind of identify with a trade or something, and Licoricia, which meant sweetmeat apparently at the time, so it's not actually licorice, which is a little different taste. So she apparently used that name. Interestingly enough, she was born around the year 1200. And when I look back at it, and this was like an onion that was unpeeling for me, because when you go back in English history dates back, the first recorded kind of town history apparently was in 774, which is quite a way back. That's only a couple of hundred years after the Roman Empire was destroyed. Apparently she lived around the year, she was born around the year 1200. around 1190, there was some very, very serious pogroms in England. Matter of fact, we were in York many years ago, and there's a tower in York which is dedicated to, I think, 150 Jews that were at that time murdered and slaughtered in the pogrom. As most of you know, Jews were money lenders. That was their main occupation because the Catholic Church, or whatever church was in charge at the time, I guess it was pre-Henry.
Yeah, it's pre-Henry.
Yeah, pre-Henry. So I think it was, they were still Catholic at the time, they
Absolutely.
forbid money lending for their own people, or usurious rates, whatever that meant. But the interesting thing about her is that she lived during this really, really hectic time in England when Jews were basically discriminated against, persecuted against, and so forth. Lived in very, very harsh times. Some people said she was the most important and the wealthiest Jewish woman in all of medieval England. Now, when I looked her up a little bit more from the article, a couple of very interesting things happened. Is that in 1215, a very significant event happened in English history, and that was the signing of the Magna Carta. And that was only when she was probably a teenager. So what was the Magna Carta all about? It was basically, as I understand it, a document where the barons were kind of getting back at the king and saying, hey, we're going to rebel. We're not going to allow you all of these unmitigated powers that you have for being a king, and we're going to let you, we want you to return some of these powers. But included in the Magna Carta Act at that time were certain restrictions about Jews. There were about 2 or 3 sentences or paragraphs that have what are called the Jewish exclusions in the Magna Carta, which again specifies that Jews can only charge a certain very, very low interest rate. It talks about the fact that if a Jew owes money, if a baron in particular owes money to a Jewish money lender, and the baron dies, then his wife is not obligated to pay to pay off the sum of the money. So there's a lot of those kind of things. So how did this affect the king? Because that was a direct swipe at the king. And something I didn't realize at that time was that if you lived on a person's land and were so-called a serf at that time, apparently you were almost owned by that person. The lord of the manor was really the guy who was in charge, and he owned the serfs at that time. But who owned the Jews was the king. Under a special proclamation, the Jews there and all of their property were part of the king. So the barons, in a way, were getting back at the king, saying that, and the king needed the Jews' money as part of the tax money that he would use for, whatever his purposes were, starting wars or having an army and things like that. But the thing that was really interesting is that Jews were part of his personal property at the time. So as part of that, he acted as almost a protector of the Jews. So how did it come about that she funded Westminster Abbey, which was in serious need of repair at the time? Her first husband dies, and he's fairly wealthy. And as part of the death, it goes to what's called the Jewish agency of the Exchequer, which is like the Treasury Department of England. And they have this Jewish agency there that basically is, as I could tell, a series of accountant kind of people. And they figure out, well, this person died, here's the tax because he died, that has to go to the king because you really are owned by the king. And they force her to pay an enormous amount of tax, something like 5,000 marks, which in those days, somebody made, in one of the articles I read, they made a comparison that something like about that amount of money would have been enough to have fortified and shipped and built something like almost 600 ships at the time and brought them up for trade. So it was an enormous amount of money. And at the time, because of, I guess, the fact that they wanted to make sure that she complied with their wishes, her husband dies and she's sent into the Tower of London. So having to pay the debt, now she goes to the Tower of London and she has to be there until this whole thing is adjudicated by this Jewish agency of the Exchequer, until they make their decision on how much it is. So she goes into the Tower of London. They say, okay, you own 5,000 pounds. She agrees to pay the 5,000, whatever it is, to it and things like that. And they use that money for the renovation of Westminster Abbey. So that's kind of the misleading headline that brought this whole thing about.
What was her name again?
Her name is Lycoracia. It's like licorice. And there were many names. There's Amandias, there's, Safarinella, women adapted these kind of names. So she gets out of jail and she marries another guy who is also a very, very wealthy man, David of Oxford. And she has a couple of kids from David of Oxford. And she continues in this money lending, but now under the more serious restrictions that take place at this time. So she leads this life of being this particular moneylender, along with other Jewish women and along with other foreigners that were permitted to lend money, but even at larger rates than the Jews were permitted. But the amazing thing is, because the Jews are basically property of the king, she apparently has this special status and she's got this in with the king so that she's able to grant favors for the Jewish community. So she's kind of like, then around 1290, the Jews are expelled, right? They're totally expelled. And again, they're expelled because of the relationship with the barons. The barons say, the king wants to tax the barons. And the barons say, uh-oh, no way. We've had enough money from you and things like that. So then they kind of reach this agreement. This is what I could find out, is that the barons say, okay, it's like a second Magna Carta. We'll allow you to give you some tax money of ours, but you got to get rid of the Jews. Now it's getting rid of the Jews, and that became apparently the main motivation for the expulsion of the Jews in 1290. Now, the interesting thing is, and you can go on the internet, is that in the town of Winchester, which we had visited it when we were in England, but we knew Winchester because of the song Winchester Cathedral. Right. Remember that song that was pretty popular years ago? Yeah. It's kind of a musical cathedral. But if you go, if in the town of Winchester now, they started a fund and there is a statue that is being built of Lycoracia. And they had an unveiling of the statue of a maquette. A maquette is a model that a sculpture usually makes. It's a small model. And from that, they then, say, yes, make these changes or something, and then build it into the larger thing. And that's going to be unveiled on Jewry Street, Jewry, in Winchester, sometime in the future. And you can go on the internet and you could look this up, the statue of Lycoracia. It's hard to pronounce the name. Licorice. Licorice is the key. And you could see the statue, and you could hear about why they decided now to try and do this as a symbol of religious tolerance. So once again, getting back to Michael's point, a moneylender, her significance in the Jewish community, yeah, because she was owned by the king. She didn't basically fund Westminster Abbey willingly. It was part of, you belong to me, I'll take your money when your husband dies and things like that. But the backstory, I think, is what's become so interesting. And you can see the model of the statue. It's her holding her one little boy as they're walking around there, and it's going to be in the town of Winchester. So it's a fascinating story that it's like an onion. It just kind of unraveled as I was reading it and got involved in it. Yeah, Flo?
Larry, how did you get to this list? It's fascinating because it's people we would never have thought of. And
well, I didn't make up the list. I got an article from the Forward, the Jewish Forward.
From the Forward.
Now, and the Forward said that here are some women that we now know some things about, and they're paintings of women. I think there were about 6 or 9 of them on the list. I forget how many. And since we were doing Jewish women, and I sent an email to Rabbi Haas and said, this would be interesting. Maybe if we talked about a couple of these. These are lesser known characters. Yeah. And he enthusiastically said, yeah, maybe we could pick 1 or 2 and talk.
Floss, I just Googled Jewish women, and that list came up.
Yeah,
I actually had the list before Larry and the Rabbi sent.
We had a mixture of really well known, like Henrietta Zold, kind of well known, like Bruria, and then several who maybe fairly well known, but I had not heard of. So it's nice to hear about these women who have not garnered this mass publicity, but yet are just as important. So thank you to everyone. That was terrific. I enjoyed this. Yes, Flossie, even though I missed 10 minutes with my computer.
All right. Look, don't know if it's too late. I have one if you want to save it. I don't want to go over.
Well, that's what I'm going to ask. Next week, we're supposed to do Jews in Vegas, but we can also continue and do one more session on Jewish women. I thought this was really interesting because we only got to like 5 or 6.
I have one also.
And Karen does. So next week, we'll do Jewish women, and we'll start with Karen, remind me, please. Next week, we'll start with Karen, Rena, and who else did I just, and
Plus.
Flossie, okay. So we'll do one more time of Jewish women. If anybody wants to look up some, we'll do that. But we're going to start with these 3. And then if we have extra time, I have a bunch of them that I looked up, but I won't use any of them. And I like how it's gone such a wide range. You have Zionists, you have a moneylender, you've got a scholar, you've got a partisan. So really well-rounded and not the usual, you know, we didn't have Gloria Steinem, who of course is amazing, but you know.
How do you know?
I know stuff.
I didn't pick her, but it would be very appropriate with the suffragettes now.
Oh, yeah. So,
100 years, yeah.
So I'm,
Rabbi,
who'd you pick, Rena, so we don't get that one?
no, I was away. This was fabulous. I just want to say that I love this. I'd like to continue it, but I had a question for Larry, a quick question about the town where they're putting up the statue.
Yeah.
He said that there was a
Winchester.
jewelry street.
Yeah, it's Winchester.
Is that
Is the name of the, Winchester is the name of the city, Winchester, England.
Is that because there are many Jews that live there? How did that come about that they're putting
Well,
up
she
the
lived
statue?
there. That was her town. That was a town in which she had lived.
Right, because
That was
there's
the
so
town
much
that
anti.
Licoricia, that was the town in which Licoricia had lived.
Oh, okay. So with all this anti-Semitism, it's interesting that they're putting up this statue in the town. But does jewelry mean Jews? That's
Yeah, Jewelry Street. It is a street of Jews. The end of the story is kind of interesting too, because it's a mystery in which she and her servant girl were found murdered, apparently in the house, and apparently a large amount of money was stolen. So there's this other layer to it, which has yet to be, you know, there's very little.
Right.
The amazing thing about England is that, I mean, the history of England is so well documented because of church records in particular. And, you know, the fact that it's in the English language, and it just is an unbelievable, not easy, but with the internet now, you can just, you know, unveil all of these layers that take place. It has just become unbelievable. But the English documents are really well documented. And the history goes back. It makes our history look, you know, like modern history.
Larry.
Karen, did you want to say
Larry?
something?
I want to just comment, piggyback on what Larry said. I'm sorry. Oh, Carol. We were did a couple of river cruises in Germany and, you know, Holland and some other places, but we noticed a lot of the small towns have streets named Jew Street. Do you remember that, Stuart?
Yeah, very common.
And a lot of cases it would be like a section where the Jews lived, or maybe there was an old synagogue there, but we were so surprised to find these Jew streets in Germany. So maybe that was something that happened a lot.
I just wanted,
Carol? Yeah.
I just wanted to say something. As Larry, as you were speaking, and you were talking about the fact that the Catholic Church didn't allow money lending, it occurred to me that several women we were talking about, including Donna, I wonder what would have happened to them, because they were heirs to all of this fortune, if the Catholic Church did allow money lending. This might have never, history could have changed totally. If these women didn't come to the fore with money lending, because if the Catholic Church didn't allow it, they wouldn't need these women. And the need for these women they use them actually.
Yeah, well, that's a Quentin Tarantino movie, you know, of redoing history. So yeah, they're hypotheticals. They're all interesting, but yeah, you could write. Yeah, it'd be an interesting movie.
Yeah. Well, I think all of these people are fascinating. I look forward to hearing. So everyone, please look up a couple others. Next week, we're going to remind me also, if you don't mind. It was Karen. It was Rena, and who was the third one again?
Flossie.
Okay, Flossie. So we'll
She's not
begin.
gonna talk to you in a little while.
She's not gonna talk to me because I've forgotten it was her twice, but
Twice.
so again, it's gonna be Rena, Karen, and who was the third one again?
Okay.
All right, stay safe, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good job, everybody.
Thank you.
Well done.
Bye-bye.
Meeting. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye now.